Through the rifle's scope, the wolves stood like statues in the snow, one black and one gray, standing perfectly still, their ears cocked forward, their eyes on him. Turnbull had cut their tracks on the Chief Joseph Highway at dawn, about a mile and a half from his cabin, and pulled over to investigate. A few minutes of studying the ground told him what he needed to know. There were at least a half dozen of them, and they had passed through not long before he did, heading south toward a ridge known as Cathedral Cliffs. He'd left the two-lane highway on a private drive that belonged to a friend, then angled as best he could toward the ridge on gravel roads before he was forced to park and head out on foot, sounding his predator call as he went. He saw only two, but there was no point in waiting for the rest. He might never get a better opportunity than the one he had right now. He decided he wanted the gray. He exhaled and squeezed the trigger. At the rifle's crack, the black wheeled and flew into the brush. The gray staggered and dropped. It was a long walk through the snow to where she lay, but Turnbull barely felt the weight of his rifle and his snow boots as he got underway. This was a trophy very few people in his part of the world had ever taken. Hi, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. What you just heard was an excerpt from the climax of this book, American Wolf. Subtitle: A True Story of Survival and Obsession in the West. I picked this book up in 2018 and I bought it new. I bought it on the flight home from working at that summer camp I worked at in 2018 and 2019. And it stood out because it's about wolves. It's about nature, and it was about one wolf in particular, one of the Yellowstone wolves. Looking at it now, I'm looking at some of the praise for this book, and some of it stands out in an interesting way. There's a quote in the opening pages. It would be so lovely to not have to follow the sense of the politics, the laws, the cattle, the humans, the hunters, the roads. It would be so lovely to just stay in the dark woods and concentrate only on pure, unencumbered biology, foot sizes and body weights, diets, range, and distribution. It would also be fiction. That is a quote from Rick Bass, The 9 Mile Wolves, which I believe I've already covered on this channel. Another quote here is indicative of why one author in particular has been included in the praise. Gripping and fascinating. Wolf versus wolf, wolf versus man, and man versus man. Margaret Atwood, author of The Handmaid's Tale and Hagseed. This a quote via Twitter. Another piece of praise from the New York Times book review is from Rick Bass. There are cherished, striking images here, testament to the ever-flowing life force that is the wolf. This is a book similar to The 9 Mile Wolves, whereas The 9 Mile Wolves very heavily focused on a pack of wolves distant from Yellowstone, but still in the state of Montana. This book focuses on Yellowstone wolves within the main part of the park in Wyoming. And more particularly, it focuses on one of the alpha females, one who was very visible to the public during her life, and one whose death was both visible and the focus of the excerpt I read at the start of the video, which is a spoiler alert. Most Yellowstone wolves, if they are famous because they are poached. And what we see in that excerpt isn't necessarily poaching, but is the killing of a wolf that strayed just a bit off of national park property into an area where it could be killed. There are a couple names in this book that are familiar to me, mostly because they show up in other books regarding wildlife, especially in the United States of America, especially in the greater Western Rocky Mountains perspective, that being Doug Smith and Rick McIntyre. And I know those names, I've seen those names. I cannot for the life of me pinpoint which books exactly I've seen them referenced in. Rick McIntyre is actually referred to in The 9 Mile Wolves, which, as I mentioned, I've already read. And in the introduction Rick Bass gave in 1992, he also lists a couple other authors, which I've seen a lot of. Peter Mathiasen's Wildlife in America. He was the one who wrote The Snow Leopard. There's Barry Lopez of Wolves and Men, which I have it on my shelves, and I know for a fact it's on my shelves. He references other important names that are known and discussed in the greater predator wildlife management scene in the Rocky Mountains. Sadly, the last couple chapters of this book focus on the death of 06 and the impact that had on Yellowstone as a whole, especially the researchers there. It says, the law said hunters had to check wolves in with Wyoming Game and Fish within 24 hours. The hunter drove into Cody, Wyoming later that morning, Thursday, December 6th, 2012, with the wolf in the bed of his truck. He found Mark Brusino, the large carnivore section supervisor, and he wasn't happy to see the collar on the animal in the bed of the pickup because for the second time that month, he'd be calling the wolf office in Yellowstone to tell Doug Smith that another one of his wolves had been shot in Crandall. He pulled the collar off the gray and took a look at the serial number, and it meant nothing to him. But Smith would know which pack she came from. He called and left a message on his voicemail, reading off the serial number so that Smith could have it when he returned to the office. And in a few hours, Turnbull was surprised to get a call from Brusino. He'd heard back from the wolf office in Yellowstone. "You just pissed off a whole bunch of people," he said. And then following that, the next morning, Rick McIntyre is in his SUV. They get the news. Everyone that gets the news is disappointed. 06 was, and it still does, this book does to some degree use the alpha terminology that is mostly been debunked in a biological sense, in that an alpha wolf isn't the way that most researchers referenced it. It's not like a necessarily dominant wolf per se. Wolf packs are organized by families, and the mother or the father is usually the one that really controls that pack. And in some cases, it's the female. In the case of 06, this female wolf is the best hunter in her pack. She ends up having a pack of a litter of puppies, and those puppies are then her pack, and those that stay with her don't breed because they're just helping their mother with producing more puppies. And some of those children then leave the pack and start their own, or are kind of like what they do is not quite like a bachelor party per se, like how some groups of males will stick together in some species, but young animals sticking together, not necessarily for the purpose of breeding, but for the purpose of being able to stay alive, and with that understanding that larger animals can really only be hunted in groups. So those large packs you see hunting bison in some videos, in some documentaries, those are extended families helping themselves. It's not necessarily large groups of unrelated animals. And sometimes, in the case of like Never Cry Wolf by Farley Mowat, it could be two related males and then one female, and the two related males in that case are brothers, but the female is the mating pair of one of those males. The brother, sticks around because he's helping his brother, the mating brother, his puppies grow to adulthood. And so in that case, it's that wolf is nicknamed Uncle Albert by Farley Mowat out of an affectionate naming sense. But not all wolves are necessarily in a pack are descendants of those two, the alpha, the breeding, the mating pair. They're not necessarily descendants, but because they are family, they contribute to the pack. And 06 is the dominant female in her pack. And what they discuss in this is that the job of the parent wolves, the mating wolves in any pack, is to educate the pups on how to be adult wolves. And a significant portion of that is the cultural knowledge passed down through generations of how to hunt elk, how to hunt bison, how to hunt deer, rabbits, fish, whatever they primarily hunt, caribou, muskoxen. That is taught from generation to generation. The ability to hunt and the knowledge to kill for food is ingrained in their blood, but the techniques are not. And so a wolf pack where there's immature puppies and the adults are killed, those puppies aren't going to know how to take down big prey, and they're not going to have learned that risk management that goes into hunting bigger prey. And so those orphaned young wolves end up oftentimes preying upon easy prey: cows, horses, sheep, goats, livestock that don't have self-defense techniques ingrained in them, taught to them by their parents, the way that elks or bison would have that self-defense taught to them and learned. And so the death of 06 as the dominant hunter in her pack means that her puppies are likely to end up living off the park because they're not good at defending themselves from more strong and dominant wolves in the Lamar Valley. They're more likely to turn to hunting livestock because that's not risky, because that's not, or rather it's not risky in certain ways. It's because they're not taught how to hunt elk in a good way. And so these wolves are doomed or fated to a more challenging life, one that is more likely to intersect with humans. The identity of the hunter who shot 06 remained something of a mystery. Unlike his friend Mike Hirsch, Turnbull had kept his name out of the papers. It says, the enormous backlash following 06's death seemed to change the dynamic in the national debate over wolves. 6 months after her death, Fish and Wildlife published its proposal to delist wolves throughout most of the lower 48, which honestly sounds bizarre. The death of a prominent wolf leading the Fish and Wildlife Service to remove protections for wolves rather than reinforce those protections. There's just a lot that goes on in this book, a lot of descriptions of the main human players in this story, the main researchers and all. The last thing I really want to discuss in this rant is that earlier in the video I mentioned that Margaret Atwood was commenting and praising this book, and part of that is because right under the Rick Bass the 9 Mile Wolves quote that I referenced earlier is this one: all stories are about wolves, all worth repeating, that is. Anything else is sentimental drivel. Think about it. There's escaping from the wolves, fighting the wolves, capturing the wolves, taming the wolves, being thrown to the wolves or throwing others to the wolves so the wolves will eat them instead of you, running with the wolf pack, turning into a wolf, best of all, turning into the head wolf. No other decent stories exist. That quote is cited Margaret Atwood, The Blind Assassin. About a year ago, I discussed the book Vicious, Wolves and Men in America. And a major theme in that book is that Christianity attaches to itself a sheep mentality. And when the Puritans came to America, to Massachusetts, and saw that there were so many wolves in this new land, their main goal in establishing the colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was establishing a shining city upon the hill. And that needed to be safe for the flock. With the wolves around, they couldn't do much. And from what I understand, I haven't read The Handmaid's Tale personally, but I know that a large part of it involves a Judeo-Christian denomination exercising control over people. And I've heard criticism for it, I've heard praise for it, but the shining city upon the hill, that control is rooted in shepherding people, in that Christian mindset of the flock, the people being the sheep, the lambs of God, and all of that imagery playing itself into wolves being evil because they prey upon us. And that mentality bakes itself into a lot of the anti-predator mindset of the westward expansion. And even today, wolves are demons. They are evil in the barest sense of the word to a large part of American citizens. And so the effort to conserve and preserve their population, allow them to reintroduce into the wild, is fought by people that have this anti-wolf mindset ingrained in them, taught to them from childhood. And that is what these wolves have to fight against, what these reintroducing people have to fight against, what conservationists that champion wolves have to fight against. I paid full price for this book. It was $16 and probably a bit more just because I paid for it at the airport, but it was a really good book that I absolutely loved, and I've read it a couple times. Nate Blakeslee makes an amazing case for this pack of wolves and 06 in particular, and the effect that she has on the sort of people that go to Yellowstone National Park. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant.